Welcome to TransCelerate's presentation of a validation framework for artificial intelligence-based solutions in pharmacovigilance. Members of the Intelligent Automation Opportunities, or IAO workstream, have provided subject matter expertise to develop this framework. TransCelerate Biopharma is a nonprofit organization that works towards streamlining and accelerating the research and development of new therapies around the world. Membership is made up of 20 sponsor companies, and the vast majority of our solutions are free and publicly available on our website. Our solutions aid R&D operations for preclinical, clinical, the patient journey, and pharmacovigilance. The IAO team's background is in pharmacovigilance, or PV. The reason they are so interested in applying intelligent automation solutions to PV is pictured here. We have the number of adverse event cases reported annually to the FDA. You can see the increase year after year, which corresponds to increased effort and resources marketing authorization holders must expend in order to take in, process, and report individual case safety reports, or ICSRs, which contain information about adverse events experienced by patients. This increased burden on the PV system is a problem that many companies are trying to address with automation technologies. As those technologies become increasingly intelligent, companies also want to generate more insights for patient safety. We realize the interest in intelligent automation is not limited to PV. This graph illustrates the number of AI and deep learning related healthcare investments made in recent years. It has also increased over time, especially since 2018, the same year TransCelerate began their study of intelligent automation opportunities in PV. The next graph shows the increasing expectations for AI-based technologies in the pharmaceutical industry. Many companies are counting on AI to impact the industry in the coming years. So the investments and the expectations are broader than just PV, although that's our focus with this work. Here are some examples of areas that intersect PV, like quality, where some companies are using machine learning techniques to optimize their auditing plans by using different risk factors to generate a model that can recommend specific entities to audit within the following year. In the clinical area, some companies apply machine learning techniques to optimize recruitment rates by developing models to select countries and investigative sites for clinical trials. In the regulatory area, companies are using natural language processing to mine labels and assessments. Auto-translation also seems to be gaining popularity for facilitating the submission of reports to health authorities worldwide. Finally, a widespread use case of these types of techniques in safety is applying natural language processing and machine learning to automate the data entry of adverse event case reports. So these technologies are used across the spectrum, potentially subjecting them to GXP computer system validation requirements. That assumption was the starting point for TransCelerate's validation framework, to study the methodology for validating these types of systems. Because companies are already starting to implement them and also have the regulatory requirement to validate them, we wanted to identify some best practices. Our work to date has been published and is available online via open access, but first we will contextualize that paper with some examples. TransCelerate began to classify automated PV systems and asked a number of questions. Is such a classification necessary? Does industry already have what it needs to validate emerging AI-based systems? Is the current regulatory guidance sufficient? We began to think a classification was needed to account for these newer technologies. But we begin with rule-based static systems. This system is relatively simple in that it does a particular job with specific requirements. Think, if this, then that. You may use rule-based systems when your email filters separate incoming emails into different folders based on your preference. These systems are often represented by robotic process automation, or RPA, and can be applied in PV for expedited reporting rule configuration. Rule-based systems are generally easy for humans to understand and well established. The second category of automated PV systems, which we now see emerging, is AI-based static systems. These systems are relatively more complex. If we continue our email example, imagine that instead of using simple rules to separate your emails, the system studies your behavioral patterns with email and decides what rules to use to set up your email. Your inbox is now the result of a model created for you and not by you. Your emails are sorted and filtered based on your previous history. So that would be the difference. An AI-based static system uses historical behavioral patterns to create new rules. We are talking about a locked model for this category, which means those new rules don't change until the system is retrained, or it may not change at all if the system is never retrained. Safety use cases for AI-based static systems include the auto-translation of source documents. We have also started to see applications within the ICSR process, such as duplicate checking or facilitating causality assessments. However, for this category of an automated PV system, we argue that the current regulatory framework is insufficient and needs to be extended to account for aspects unique to AI-based systems. The final category the IAO team identified is called AI-based dynamic systems. It is like the AI-based static system, but the key difference is that it is not locked between specific training activities. Instead, it will continuously improve and change the model's parameters in real time as it ingests live data. To continue the email analogy once more, as you continue interacting with your email, you may continuously see new filtering based on your reactions to the previous filtering. You may or may not like these continuous changes, but the idea and hope is that the model will improve over time without having to intervene in the way that a static model would be unlocked for training. When it comes to more complex patient safety systems, reaching that level of trust can be challenging. We are unaware of any such systems currently operating in the highly regulated PV space, so we decided to focus on the emerging AI-based static systems. Here we break down the difference between a classical rule-based system and an AI-based static system. A rule-based system is process-driven, suitable for simple tasks with set parameters, and relatively quick and easy to set up. Companies can use existing computer system validation tools, and the automation is generally easy to maintain, if the task is not too complex. If it becomes too complicated, the benefits of this kind of automation may disappear compared to the effort required to update and revalidate. The objective of rule-based automation should be generally intuitive. Still, if you add too many rules, that may also disappear and you could end up with an overly complex system trying to meet a new, unintended standard. There are many tasks, particularly in the highly transactional ICSR process, that are well suited to rule-based automation. We should not assume that progressing from rule-based to AI-based automation is always optimal. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But in our view, intelligent automation is about both being smart with the tasks we automate and getting smarter by leveraging emerging AI-based technologies. AI-based static systems are data-driven in contrast to process-driven rule-based systems. AI-based systems are suitable for complex instances where simple rules are just not enough. These systems can understand relationships between variables by using historical data. AI-based systems can analyze the complex interaction between the data and then return an assessment for a task like an ICSR causality assessment. But in these situations, we must understand the data we're working with throughout the entire process to find features that explain the outcome. AI-based systems must be developed with good data to build confidence that the model will work as intended in production when it encounters real-world data. The possibility that this may not happen introduces a new risk, which is data itself. With rule-based systems, having a good process can eliminate a lot of issues. But with AI-based systems, now you need to make sure that the data is good, the data is correct, and the data accounts for everything the model may encounter in production. Because these systems are generally locked, another risk to consider is model drift. This is where the model, as initially trained, was a good representation of the data, but that has changed over time such that it is no longer representative of the data you are asking the model to make rules for. In this case, you can run into a lot of issues, which is why it's important to continuously update this model with current sets of data. Here we have another comparison of rule-based and AI-based systems in terms of how they process data. The RPA bot is rule-based and focuses on repeatable tasks. The system can reliably perform these tasks if it is configured with a comprehensive list of what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. This bot may require a lot of granularity and attention to detail around requirements for all possible situations. The machine learning algorithm has a higher level requirement. You need to know what you want to accomplish, but you don't necessarily need to tell it how to use the data. That's nice, but it also creates new types of challenges not encountered with rule-based systems. Now we will introduce TransCelerate's framework. TransCelerate's validation framework for AI-based systems is based on seminal works by ISPE GAMP5 as well as recent work by FDA, which is referenced in the paper. But what does it look like in practice? Traditional computer system validation is based on the GAMP5 methodology and often represented with a V shape. We follow a similar pattern here, but the V is closed at the base and connected, indicating a feedback loop. Just as we do with the traditional framework, we began the development of an AI-based static system by planning. At this same time, we are defining the requirements and specifications, and we are also starting to gather the data that will be required to train and test the model. This is where some of the key differences for AI-based systems come into play. Developing and testing AI models requires a significant amount of data, and data needs to be identified by subject matter experts who understand the nature of the data and its source. This is where the role of all experts collectively is critical to identify the required data, ensure that it's representative of the business, and ensure it meets the required quality. That requires SMEs to work together throughout the process. As system owners finish defining the requirements and specifications and begin the model development, they use the training data to develop and refine the model and to ensure the model represents and produces the outputs that will be expected per the specifications. There must be enough data to train the model across the scenarios that may be encountered by the system once it's in production. Once the model has been developed, user acceptance testing can occur. And then, once that is successfully completed, the model in the system can be deployed into production. There needs to be a plan for monitoring the system in production, and that should be developed in parallel to the model. The monitoring strategy is required to ensure the system is consistently producing the expected results. Recognizing that training data cannot be exhaustive, ongoing monitoring is essential to ensuring continued system performance and capture along the way of any snares that were not anticipated during development. This captured information can then be used to determine whether the model needs to be revised in a future release. Then the data can be used to account for these missed scenarios. Setting defined thresholds as part of the monitoring process is also critical. As more experience is gained with the model in production, it may be decided that the model needs to be improved. Here is where the results of the production monitoring are fed back into the planning, requirements, and development so that the cycle can repeat again. This is a very high-level overview of the framework as it applies to AI-based static systems. Now that we've introduced the framework at a high level, we will discuss 5 different topics in greater detail to explain where we see some of the differences and best practices that we've tried to highlight in our paper. The first topic is about system requirements. At first glance, it may look like something that is very straightforward and that it would be the same as would be done for rule-based systems. It probably helps to put this into perspective with some of the older or different ways of doing this. On the left-hand side of this table, we see processes that are done by humans. The types of use cases for these applications are very flexible, of course, and that's a big advantage of manual work. It's very adaptive. Requirements are typically defined in SOPs and other instructions, and the level of detail will vary. To ensure consistent quality, the important piece is the training and clarity of instruction provided to the operators who are actually doing the work. Errors can, of course, be systematic if there is an issue with the instruction, but beyond that, it's usually some random variation linked to human performance. Rule-based automation in the center column depends on a series of logical steps. You would typically begin with a set of quite detailed requirements in which you would try to spell out all the different steps and possible exception cases. For a technology like RPA, it is possible to go to an excruciating level of detail around requirements to where you may have several pages dedicated to how one step will be performed. This may be necessary because the link between requirements and quality here is that one must ensure the set of requirements is correct and exhaustive for what an organization is trying to do. In contrast to human systems, rule-based systems produce systematic types of error. If you miss a step, if something isn't working, there is a systematic aspect to that error, and you can look back at similar cases that also have been processed incorrectly. Now moving to AI-based systems, we have almost a mix between the previous two system types. In terms of use cases, you're able to tackle more complex use cases than what rule-based systems can handle because AI-based systems are based on an application of pattern recognition, in the case of machine learning. So it's somewhere in between not having the full flexibility of human minds but being able to deal with more different scenarios than rule-based systems can generally accommodate. In terms of requirements, because of the way these systems are being developed, requirements must be defined at a high level. Humans cannot fully understand how the machine is trained and will therefore not be able to articulate detailed specifications for each of the steps. A lot of times we may not even know exactly how the system is coming to a certain conclusion. That uncertainty can be challenging when you want to have consistent output because quality is no longer dependent on how well the requirements were detailed. Now, quality depends on the completeness of your training set and the algorithm's performance. In terms of errors, there will be a certain systematic aspect to them, but the difficulty is that you won't always be able to understand the faulty logic that produced the errors. So, AI-based systems raise some questions. We know that these algorithms have a certain level of performance and that performance is not going to be without error. That doesn't look as deterministic as with rule-based systems. Is it acceptable that the system makes mistakes, and if so, how does our quality system deal with these mistakes that can vary, are often unpredictable, and are difficult to test for? So what is a good expectation for performance? A lot of rule-based systems are built with an assumption that it will work correctly 100% of the time if it follows the specification. That assumption no longer applies to an AI-based system in theory, but the same could be said of a human-based system. Humans will make mistakes, yet an acceptable level of error may not be explicit criteria, and therefore the baseline quality of the current process may not be defined. So it's best practice to have that discussion in the beginning to arrive at an acceptable level of performance for the system. Another best practice for AI-based requirements is to define them in a smart way. For example, be specific, even though it's relatively high level, and then achievable, relevant, time-bound, and measurable. Another potential challenge is to test your requirements in the right way. Finally, the assumption for requirements is that organizations will know what is right. That's the ground truth, but it may not always be easy to determine. Some PV processes are not black and white and cannot be defined with clear, unambiguous rules, so it can be challenging to define what we call the crown treatise. That's why it's essential to have a set of data with the true answers, which in PV terms could be validated health outcomes you are seeking to achieve or avoid. To summarize some of the best practices for requirements from our paper, the first is to define the right level of performance for your process. In our view, this will depend on the intended use and should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. It should really be about the criticality and the place of the system that you want to implement within your current process, which will require close collaboration between PV business owners and IT experts. You will need to arrive at a consensus regarding what you want to achieve with this type of technology. It may also be beneficial to really distinguish your desired system performance from the overall process performance. What we mean by that is that it's often helpful to introduce an AI-based system initially where the technology suggests an outcome that is then reviewed by a human processor and changed if needed. This may be a safer way to implement AI-based technology while gaining more confidence in the performance of the output and before full automation. There can be a flip side, however, to the human factor in quality if people start having too much confidence in the system's output. That could conceivably lead to a less vigilant human QC step and, in that case, a potential risk that is introduced over time. Another best practice is to make the performance target explicit in your requirements. For example, if you have an application that translates English to French, you will need to know what level of accuracy is good enough, especially if you want to fully automate that task. Desired performance should not be limited to a percentage of cases that is correct. You should also think about the types of errors that you want to allow. This is about specificity and sensitivity. On which side do you want to make an error? Do you want to be overly conservative, or do you want to make sure that you include the right cases in your output? What cases are critical to your process, and how can you use that knowledge to define your requirements? The last best practice here is to understand that your system requirements will be linked to the data you use for the training sets. That is, your system will need to work on that scope of application. And this is really something that you need to include in your requirements as well to define which type of data this specific system will work with. These are some of our ideas about requirements and specifications. Now let's talk more about data. In discussing data selection, it can be helpful to use a simple analogy from the classroom of your childhood. Do you remember learning math? When children are starting off, a typical approach is to learn multiplication tables, orders of operations, and other formulas first. These are typically presented with examples to teach a student the relationships inherent within these rules and to apply them to given values x to solve for unknown values y. This can be thought of as training data. The student is then presented with problems to complete. These problems require the application of one or more rules from training and often use numbers that differ from the examples that were provided during training. The problems test the students to see how they're doing. This is like the test data. It's where you have the problem statement, but you have no answer. That's the test. It evaluates how well the training was done. You might use the test results to define a threshold. For example, if the average student is solving 80% of the problems correctly, then the training may be judged to be acceptable. If the student's performance is below that, maybe the teacher decides to adjust how he or she is teaching the students on the application of a particular math rule. This process may repeat until a certain benchmark is reached or the training is otherwise deemed to be adequate. We are doing something similar for a machine learning implementation. We are training a model and then testing it. It's very important that the data used for training is not an exact copy of the test data. That would lead to something called overfitting, and it will skew the performance of the model because the model was only asked to do exactly what it was taught to do. What you want to see is how well the model reacts when it applies the general pattern of the training data to new test data. So, the training data really needs to be representative of the test data the model will later encounter, but not the exact same. It needs to be representative of the problem you're trying to solve, whether that's multiplication or some aspect of adverse event processing. In our example of multiplication, if you start testing it on subtraction, the system will not know what to do. That is, the test will not be valid. So you really want to go through a process of understanding the data you're selecting, understanding the real-world environment of the data that will later be fed into the model, and making sure the test data is representative of the real world, like data that the model is going to see later. It all starts with what is called the ground truth, being sure the training data is accurate. 2 plus 2 needs to equal 4. 2 plus 2 does not need to equal 5 in the training data. It must be true. Similarly, in PV, a true adverse event needs to be represented accurately. It cannot be inaccurate or contain incorrect relationships because the model is being trained on patterns. Especially with very large data sets, like what we see in PV, inaccuracies in the training data can have a big impact, so they need to be eliminated or minimized. This holds true for both training and test data. The selection of good data is essential to ensuring the knowledge transfers over from training to test. In talking about how this machine learning implementation all comes together after the data challenges of model development, there are then other challenges to consider. One of them is black swan events. The story of black swans comes from 16th century London, where it was used as a statement of something impossible, something that can't happen. At the time, no one in London had ever seen a black swan, and the swan data set for Londoners only contained white swans. Dutch explorers traveled to Australia in 1697, and guess what? They found black swans. Suddenly, a new thing was introduced to the data set, and it changed everything, including the notion of what a black swan is. These days, we talk about black swan events to describe things like the Black Monday in 1987, the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, or COVID-19 in 2020. In February 2021, 3 severe winter storms swept across the United States and caused a massive electricity generation failure in the state of Texas, leading to shortages of water, food, and heat, as well as loss of life. It rarely snows in Texas, and the mitigations for a multi-day freezing event were not put in place when the state was building the infrastructure to support their power grid. For example, natural gas equipment was inadequately winterized when it would have been routine to do so in northern U.S. states with typically colder winters. The engineers did not look back far enough to understand that at certain times, in certain years, outlier freezes like this are possible. For example, Texas had a similar strong freeze in the 1970s. If engineers had studied that data and taken precautions, they could have mitigated the extreme impact of the weather event. So how can we use AI-based systems to plan for black swan events in pharmacovigilance? One suggestion is to identify a pre-planned mitigatory process where you plan for something going wrong or something breaking. This requires some level of acceptance that such an event is possible, and that's the first step toward not getting caught flat-footed if it ever does. Another suggestion is to develop triggers for human review. When you trigger a human review, you're saying, okay, something happened, we don't know exactly what happened, and we don't have a process for it, but it requires human review. Humans, way more than machine learning models, are flexible in terms of how they deal with something unknown. So if you can take an outlier and give it to human reviewers, they can figure out ways to resolve the problems. It's the golden standard of how things are currently done, but because we are talking about machine learning, it may not always happen as quickly as it could or should without predetermined triggers for human review. A third suggestion is orthogonal data mining, which is a proactive approach to the data. Here we decide to mine for information, to try to discover new aspects of the data, such as previously unknown patterns and outliers in the data that could be representative of fragments or indicators of emerging black swans. It's kind of like saying, there may be something there that we haven't yet observed, so we are going in to have a look. Again, you must begin with the assumption that there may be a black swan somewhere in the data. And then we have periodic model robustness challenges. Here we are basically saying, okay, we have this model and think we know something of how it works, but now we're going to throw some data inputs at it that it was not necessarily designed for. Then you study how the model reacts when it ingests something that is purposely wrong. That may lead to some insight that can be useful for designing ways to retrain the model, or maybe this can somehow be used with another tactic, such as triggers for human review. Next, we have frequent model updates. Keep in mind we are talking about the validation of AI-based static systems, which are only representative of the current data of receipt, that is, the data that was current at the time of training. Sometimes, as you have a model in place for a certain amount of time, the data changes, but the model stays the same. So the model can start to miss things. A black swan could even be occurring that we didn't expect during training. Frequent model updates based on the latest training data can mitigate against this. Another thing we can do is to continuously monitor the data for unanticipated changes. So for things that we didn't see coming, anything outside of the defined thresholds, any other changes that appear in our data, we can try to monitor for those things. We can highlight them, take notes, and be proactive with some other strategy, possibly using them to trigger a human review or some other related tool. Lastly, you can ensure that your metadata is kept current. Metadata is basically just data on data. It provides information on how some data is linking to other data, how it's grouped, and can also provide information into the interpretation of data fields. In short, it can help you understand what you're working with so you can better see if your data changes over time from the data you originally trained and tested your model on. So how do we balance explainability versus traceability? And what are some of the potential model development challenges? We want the model to work as expected and produce accurate but also transparent and explainable results. Explainability is the extent to which the internal mechanics of a machine or deep learning algorithm can be explained and easily understood in non-technical human terms. As a solution layers multiple technologies to increase accuracy, that increased complexity can add to the challenge of transparency and explainability. More complexity provides more power, increasing the solution's accuracy or performance, but you may sacrifice your transparency and your ability to explain or trace how the model came to an outcome. In contrast, if you have a very simple algorithm, you may have a high degree of explainability, but your accuracy may be lower. The ability to explain and understand what's going on with a solution can be directly tied to the level of perceived trust in the system performing as intended. But the question is it okay if a model can't be explained in simple or non-technical terms? And if it can't be explained, is it enough to demonstrate that the model consistently performs by meeting the defined requirements and generating the desired outcomes? When looking at the framework in terms of explainability and traceability, there are a few key considerations when selecting a model in the planning phase. Identify a solution that will meet your business and regulatory requirements with the least complexity, the highest level of accuracy, and of course, transparency. Regardless of whether the solution is human, rule-based, or AI-based, the solution is selected based on the business need, risk, and complexity of the activity. With each of these levels, however, explainability and traceability will vary widely. As mentioned previously, requirements for an AI-based system may not be as absolute compared to a rule-based system, and as a result, your requirements may need to be at a higher level, as mentioned. But consider how you document the desired accuracy of the system in terms of performance, sensitivity, specificity, and the ability to achieve specified thresholds. The difference between a simple and a complex algorithm will impact how those requirements are captured. For data selection, training and test data need to be of acceptable quality and representative of the business, and understanding the training data will support your ability to understand why an algorithm works in terms of what it's being applied to, that is, what problem it's trying to solve. All of this, if adequately specified in the planning stage, improves the explainability of the model. It also provides insight and supports our ability to explain how that model was developed as we continue the process. When performing user acceptance testing, we are better able to select the right test cases and have adequate scripts to ensure that the model will be fit for purpose. An understanding of the logic and, at a minimum, the key parameters is important to ensure that we've covered the scenarios within our acceptance testing and that we have an acceptable level of explainability. This will further carry through to the monitoring phase and even post-production. Once the solution is deployed, a monitoring quality plan with defined thresholds can ensure that the model is performing from a regulatory and business perspective. But in addition to performance thresholds, the monitoring plan should consider the limits of what the system will do while in production. Outputs from when the system doesn't meet certain performance thresholds can be used to determine whether the model requires revision. Given all these considerations from planning through development and into production, the question of whether it is okay if a model is not explainable and simplistic in non-technical terms will continue throughout, but it should first be asked early in the planning stage. Finally, there are a few things to think about as you consider your risk. What activities are being performed? What is the risk if the system doesn't perform? Can you demonstrate that system performance is acceptable? Did you get the correct outcome? And is there a need to understand or determine why it didn't work in order to correct or potentially revise the model? Another area of interest is related to the sponsor's responsibility when a vendor supplies the model. There are a variety of available supplier products, types of support, and even data sets that can be used to build a system. These offerings will continue to expand over time as we see increasingly more advances in this space. Vendors can play an important role in validation activities, whether for custom-built solutions or customized configurable systems. While there is a partnership between a sponsor and vendor when developing and implementing a vendor model, the overall regulatory accountability will remain with the system owner. During the procurement process, sponsors need to establish with vendors how to coordinate activities to ensure regulatory obligations are met. If a vendor's AI-based model is used, perhaps a simplifying methodology in combination with vendor testing may also be appropriate. But sponsors should consider how to demonstrate the model is fit for purpose and meets their requirements based on the data that was used to develop it. And this can be especially challenging if non-sponsor data was used. A defined strategy and scenarios for acceptance testing can be key here to ensuring a vendor-supplied system is fit for purpose. But regardless of whether a system is developed in-house or by a supplier, the consideration to follow the methodology will support requirements being met. So when does a sponsor become involved with a vendor-supplied system? The ideal situation is to follow the same framework and methodology regardless. That is to say, the sponsor would be involved from the beginning, whether it's from the selection of the solution, the choice of a vendor, the supplier assessment to verify adequate quality management systems as a standard, as well as the planning and requirements and specifications as a necessary baseline to ensure that any product explicitly meets the sponsor's business and regulatory requirements. That baseline will help the sponsor determine if the solution is appropriate and whether it has the right level of complexity. The data selected for model development is another big consideration for vendor management. Is the training data being provided by the vendor? If so, it could potentially be a broad data set. Can such a broad set help us predict or avoid a black swan event? Or could a broad data set be a hindrance by not meeting the sponsor's business requirements because it's not reflective of their own sponsor data? Having the sponsor provide the data set may be appealing depending on the answers to these questions. It's important to evaluate the test cases just to determine whether the model can manage your business case and is fit for purpose. The monitoring plan, while in production, still needs to be used to ensure the model meets the intended use, but it also prompts consideration of an acceptable performance threshold, the model's limitations, and the threshold triggers for things like model revision, taking action, or mitigating issues. Hopefully, this presentation has provided some relevant examples of what's new about AI-based systems and what PV organizations should keep in mind when validating these systems in a GXP environment. We do believe AI-based solutions offer new opportunities in our industry, but they also introduce some new challenges. That's why we took a first step to outline some validation considerations. We have included a link to the TransCelerate paper here, but of course, what is important is that we strive for alignment with and between regulators. Fortunately, we have seen a lot of recent movement from regulators. For example, we anticipate guidance from MHRA and EMA. Similarly, we anticipate more from FDA regarding their concept of computer software assurance, or CSA, which is a topic marked for review. CDRH also continues to advance concepts for transparency of AI and machine learning-enabled medical devices. The Danish Health Authority has also very recently published some suggested criteria for using AI-based algorithms in a GXP environment. So this is all very encouraging and indicates that regulators are thinking about and contributing to the topic. We are trying to contribute as well by putting our ideas out there as discussion starters and foundations from which relevant stakeholders can have more detailed discussions based on actual implementation experiences. Again, alignment with regulators is key, but regulators need more detail. They need PV-specific use cases to better understand the problems we are trying to address with AI-based solutions. And they need actual case studies to evaluate the range of methods that organizations are using to navigate the specific challenges related to planning, requirements and specifications, data selection, model development, acceptance testing, deployment, and monitoring. We would like to consider your ideas as well. Here are some links to the TransCelerate website so you can check for our latest solutions. If you have a story about how you have used these solutions in your own implementation journey, we would be interested to learn from you as well. Feel free to contact us here. Thanks for watching.